My name is Alison Bernstein. I'm the director of the IWL Consortium, professor of history and gender and women's studies. So I went to public schools on Long Island, and then I went to college at Vassar in Poughkeepsie, New York, and finished there and went directly to graduate school and did a PhD at Columbia University. I thought I was going to become an academic. My major was history, and I thought that my greatest aspiration was to teach history at a liberal arts college like the one I attended. First of all, I was lucky enough to have a fellowship, and that meant, ironically, that I was not expected to teach at Columbia, which in a way was a tremendous financial advantage. It was an outside fellowship, but in another way was not a career advantage because I didn't get teaching experience at Columbia while I was at graduate school. So I sought out a teaching job and got my first teaching job as a part-time lecturer adjunct at Staten Island Community College, which was a pretty far distant place from where I was living on the Upper West Side. It took me more than an hour to get to Staten Island, and between tolls and gas, I probably made no money. But at least I had the experience of teaching undergraduates, which hooked me. And I was at Staten Island Community College for a number of years and was involved deeply in the creation of a women's studies program there, which led to my being asked through some interesting and serendipitous connections to be a reviewer of proposals at a government agency called the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education while I was still pursuing my PhD. To make a long story short, I never, after the second year, was a full-time graduate student. I was teaching while going to graduate school and therefore had a longer route to getting my PhD than most students have. Although, I just have to say this, that in history, the average time to a PhD is 8 or 9 years, and in my case, it was more than a decade. While I was teaching, I got an opportunity to go work for that government agency that I was reviewing for, and so I left New York and spent several years in Washington, D.C., working for the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. So I was still in higher education, but not on a college campus. I was helping to decide who should get grants. And over time, from around the mid-70s to the early 80s, I was going to graduate school. I was working at FIPSE, Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. And as it had turned out, I was also elected to be a trustee of my alma mater. So at the age of 22, I was a Vassar trustee. So if you can imagine, I was teaching, being a graduate student, and a college trustee simultaneously. That eventually led me to the Ford Foundation. I was recruited from another teaching job in Illinois at a state university in 1983 to go to work for the Ford Foundation. I still hadn't finished my PhD, which I finished in 1985. But I started working at Ford as a program officer recommending grants and finished my PhD while there on weekends and in the summers. And then I stayed at Ford until 1990, when I returned to academia as associate dean of the faculty at Princeton University in New Jersey. And I stayed there for 3 years and published my dissertation while I was there. And then I was invited to return to the Ford Foundation, where I spent another 15 or so years, eventually becoming vice president for a set of programs called Knowledge, Creativity, and Freedom. It was around media, higher education, the arts and culture, sexuality, and religion. I came to Rutgers because in 2010, I left the Ford Foundation and became a visiting professor at Spelman College in Atlanta. And there I started research on a book that I finally published in 2013 on philanthropy in higher ed. But while I was at Spelman, some people here at Rutgers were searching for the next director of the IWL. The founding director, Mary Hartman, who I had known while I worked at Ford, had retired, and there was a national search. And some people sought me out I was in Georgia at the time and said, why don't you apply? And I have to say that I knew a lot about the IWL. Ford had been one of the funders of several of the different units of the consortium and also of the IWL program. And so it was not unusual for me to be interested in what Rutgers was doing with issues of women and gender leadership. So that together, all of that in my judgment, makes me a kind of hybrid. I was trained as an academic, but I have had at least half, if not more, of my career in nonprofit philanthropy, as starting out at the lower end as a program officer and eventually achieving a vice president. Risk-taking, I think it's important for all people, but especially for women, to not be risk-averse, to look for opportunities to make a difference wherever they are and wherever they might be. So when I was teaching and the chance came to become a reviewer of proposals for a funding agency in Washington, D.C., I thought, well, that's an interesting opportunity. Let me see what that's all about. That led me actually to being offered a job at that same organization. I think another factor is mentorship. When I was both at Staten Island Community College, which is now the College of Staten Island, and even in the State University in Illinois, which is now the University of Illinois Springfield, I had mentors, both men and women, but especially women, who urged me to try some different kinds of things. So mentorship and sponsorship is important. And last but not least, networks. Being a part of many different networks that were focused on issues of social justice. I would say that the one continuous theme throughout my career is wherever I was interested in questions of equity, opportunity, and social justice through education. First of all, IWL is a pretty unique organization. It is an independent institute focused on women in leadership, and that's an important role in and of itself. But beyond that, IWL also helps to coordinate and represent 9 different units focused on issues of women and gender at Rutgers New Brunswick. And increasingly, we are paying attention to our role and responsibility at Rutgers Newark and Rutgers Camden. What does it mean on the day-to-day? On the day-to-day, it's helping to make strategic plans and envisioning where we can make a difference in this university and in universities like this. So one good example that I'm proud of is that we encouraged our units and key people like Mary Hawksworth to work with other women and gender study units at the Big Ten, or what is now called the CIC, the Committee on Interinstitutional Cooperation, which is something that Rutgers has just recently joined. And IWL, with Women and Gender Studies, took the lead in inviting colleagues from the other major research universities to talk about the future of women and gender studies in our institutions. Similarly, we helped to promulgate a set of guidelines for how you teach feminist leadership studies. We did this in collaboration with Barnard College and Spelman College. And again, having networks at both of those institutions made a difference, because I believe that going alone is never as good as going with other institutions to achieve a certain goal or program activity. Also, we were publishing a series of books called Junctures, which focuses on case studies of women leaders in different sectors. The first 2 are women in business and women in social movements, but there'll be a case study volume on women in higher education, on women in the arts as leaders, and what were the critical junctures of their decision making that we think deserve to be examined. For all the women we're looking at, we don't believe there's anything intrinsic biologically about being a woman leader. Socializing women does probably play a key role in their likelihood of looking for compromise and looking for collaboration. We know some of the research that suggests that. In addition, I've been spending quite a bit of time in creating and raising funds for the first ever joint endowed chair named for Gloria Steinem, called the Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies, which would be jointly owned by SCI, the School of Communication and Information, and SAS, the School of Arts and Sciences, and in particular the Department of Women and Gender Studies. Those are just some of the things we've been up to. Of course, we have been running for now more than a decade and a half a program, a special program for women undergraduates called the Leadership Scholars Program, and we admit around 20 students every year to this very elite and successful program, which students receive a credential in addition to their major or minor. We run a mentoring program called Wings for women undergraduates across the university, including some women undergraduates already from Newark. We run a program on executive leadership for women in corporations. I could go on, but those are a few of the things that we work on. I think leadership entails an ability to work with a variety of different people towards a common goal. And I think I've had some luck and maybe training in doing that, both at the Ford Foundation and having taught at a community college and a state university, and having been an associate dean at Princeton and now a director at Rutgers. I like working with people and collaborating on common goals. A second skill I think that's really crucial is writing. You have to be able to take whatever thoughts you have and translate them into accessible language that lots of people can understand. And I was lucky as a history major that I was expected to write a lot. I wrote an undergraduate honors thesis, I wrote a PhD and a master's, and at the Ford Foundation I did a lot of writing. And I think writing is a very important skill. And I sometimes worry that in this era of hashtags and tweeting and Facebook, the art of writing a compelling argument may get lost. I'm not saying it is being lost, but it worries me. I also think oral communication is very important. And in that regard, I've been lucky in my life in that I've always had some kind of public role to play, representing the Ford Foundation or representing Vassar when I was a trustee, a young trustee. And I think one of the things I've noticed about Rutgers women is that they're every bit as smart and thoughtful as Rutgers men that I've had in class, but they don't always project themselves. And I think if I have one thing to suggest by way of a skill set, and we do some training at IWL around this, it's presentational skills, being able to make an oral argument, feeling your own power and agency in a way. And women's colleges in the past have been really good places for learning that, and having Douglas Residential College here, I'm sure makes a difference. But I would say oral communication as well as written communication is a mark of a good leader, someone who can bring people to a cause or to a goal. In my case, it's always been around issues of equity, around social transformation, that kind of thing. I've written not just my dissertation, but come this April, it'll be 5 books, and several of them are co-authored, but a couple, 2, are books that I've written. And I feel very strongly that women's voices, as Gloria said, around the campfire. Gloria Steinem has a wonderful metaphor that the media is the 21st century campfire. And if women aren't at the campfire in representative numbers, I don't want to say equal to their demographic, but certainly in representative numbers, they won't have a chance to help shape reality and future realities. On the other hand, they could be at the campfire, but if they don't talk and express themselves, that would be a loss. Every day is a different day. And we're talking now about workload. Some days I am just booked solid for meetings and have no time to do the kind of writing or the kind of thinking or the kind of reflection that everybody needs. Other days, especially when I'm back in New York and have meetings in Manhattan where I live, I have space to do some writing and reflecting. One of the big challenges is that we set a goal for ourselves to raise $3 million to endow a chair in Steinem's name. And we're now, 1 year in, and we've raised over $2 million, but we have $1 million to go. And I'm very fixated on making that happen. It will be the first endowed chair in women's studies, and I believe the first endowed chair that links media studies to women's studies here at Rutgers and maybe in the country. And certainly that speaks to the power of Gloria Steinem's legacy, but also her enduring impact in terms of changing the way the media portrays women and men, for that matter. I think that Rutgers, being a huge research university, has a great deal of bureaucracy. And every institution of this size has versions of that. And I think what we can do here is sometimes constrained, not so much by people who say, no, you can't do it, but by the kind of bureaucracy that you have to sort of wade through to get to, you can do it. So yeah, bureaucracy is tough. It's not impossible by any means, and I'm getting more and more used to it. The good news is that Rutgers really allows for an entrepreneurial spirit if you cross all your T's and dot all your I's. So we've been doing some really entrepreneurial things, which I enjoy very much. So on the positive side of the ledger, there are a couple of things I would say. I enjoy the people I work with. I think they're extraordinary. And I'm not just talking about the IWL staff. We have a board of directors, we have an external advisory board, and most importantly, the students. One of the best things about the job is an ability to interact with students and do the kind of thing that you're helping me to do, which is to try to share some lessons, life lessons, career lessons with students here. I feel very strongly that a strong liberal arts education here at Rutgers, or anywhere else for that matter, is a very good preparation for many different careers in life. And in my case, I started out thinking all I wanted to be was a college professor, and I turned out to be a hybrid. I mean, I've taught in a number of different institutions, but I've also been a philanthropist, or someone, not my own money, obviously. Ford Foundation was endowed by Henry Ford, but the ability to take his values, the best of his values, because some of his values I would not subscribe to, but the best of his values to advance human welfare and operationalize that has been a really wonderful experience in my life. The most difficult decision that I had to make in my career, that's a good one. I would say leaving Ford when I did. I left the Ford Foundation after 14 years as a vice president to come back to academia, first as a visiting professor at Spelman, and then eventually to Rutgers. I think it's fair to say that I could have ended my career or finished out my career at Ford, and while I certainly enjoyed being there, it was time to move. And it's not easy to leave New York. I'm a native New Yorker, although I have to say the Spelman folks were really smart. My daughter was in law school at Emory in Atlanta, so by inviting me to come down to Spelman, it could have been 2 years there. As it turned out, it was only 1 year there as a visitor. But it was a real change for me. I've lived in other parts of the U.S. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a number of years, I guess from 1974 to 80. So that was 6 years. And I lived in Illinois for 2 years when I was at Sangamon State University, a state university, which is now the University of Illinois Springfield. So I've been in other parts of the country, but leaving Ford at the time I did was a bit of a risk. I could have just quietly wound down my Ford career. I was in my early 60s at the time. The appeal of going back to academia, which, as I said in some interview a long time ago, 5 years ago, it was my first love to be a college teacher of history and women and gender studies, and it's been the chapter that I didn't expect to have, but I'm grateful to have it. I think Rutgers is a remarkable institution. I think the IWL is unprecedented. There is no university in the country, maybe in the world, that has the array of programs focused on women that Rutgers has, and I'm exceedingly impressed with that. I think, if I'm honest, I would like Rutgers to pay more attention to this array of really special institutional units, but we're doing pretty well, and the Steinem Chair has bumped up our visibility, not just here at Rutgers, but around the country. It's a great place to work when you have wonderful students and very good colleagues. I think my graduate training, probably the best thing it prepared me for is understanding academia and being able to navigate those waters in a meaningful way. And of course I had to write a dissertation in history, which took quite a while. The good news is that I had such careful advising, and not always nurturing advising, but certainly careful advising, that when I finished my dissertation, it was ready to be published. Some scholars do dissertations and then they have to sort of spend years revising it for publication. In my case, and this was, many years ago, like I finished in '85 and then it was published in '91, but I didn't have to do much in the way of revision at all. So I do think I got good training for writing a history PhD. With regard to what really helped me to have the career I've had, I would say maybe 30 to 40% was graduate school. 60% has been what I call experience in the world, and having people who were more advanced than I was in their careers take the time to help me.
And if you could just tell me more about the 60% experiences, like which other courses actually trained you?
Well, I was in graduate school when I got this opportunity to go to work in Washington, D.C. in a federal agency, and the head of that agency, a woman, was double my age. I was at the time 25 when I got that job and still in graduate school officially. And that experience of working for her, she was a lawyer by training and had many higher education positions over the course of her life, was crucial to teaching me a lot about leadership, about how you manage things. I remember one of her most famous phrases that I've lived by is, "Do not make a decision until you're ready." People will be pressuring you all the time to kind of decide in favor of what they want to do. But unless there is a urgency to that decision, and I'm not talking now about crises or emergencies, take the time you need to get as much information as possible, as much insight, and then make the decision when you're ready. Another thing she once told me was, administrators are paid to make decisions with not fully adequate information. So it's not as if you can wait endlessly because you'll get all the information you need. It's more a matter of taking the time to do as much due diligence and digging. And in that sense, I suppose being a historian and trying to figure out what actually happened was a good preparation. A lot of college presidents come out of history, I'm told. So yeah, that experience was crucial. Another experience that was crucial was working in a community college. I often say that the community college experience was really important to me because I had gone to very elite schools like Vassar and Columbia, and it was important to see the kinds of students who were every bit as bright as a lot of the colleagues I had in both places, but they really didn't have the financial wherewithal or the opportunities and privileges I had. And I'm always interested when I teach to see how many of my students here at Rutgers are community college transfers. Financially, it's not a bad deal to go to a first-rate community college in New Jersey or anywhere else and collect your undergraduate general education credits and then transfer to Rutgers. I do believe that Rutgers embodies the principles of trying to make the most out of your experience as a student especially a woman student, because of the presence of Douglas and the presence of our consortium. But sometimes I worry that, all too often there's something called the Rutgers screw, which makes it hard for students to get the education they need. And, a big institution like Rutgers is always going to face that. When you're only teaching 2,000 students, not 40,000 students or 50,000 students, you can pay a lot more attention to every individual. Well, I went to a women's college, so I have to say that being a woman as an undergraduate was important to me, even at that time. Feminism and the second wave of the women's movement was just beginning to happen when I went to college in the late 1960s. But I did know that women's colleges in general take women seriously and women's leadership seriously. So, no, I don't think I was particularly disadvantaged by gender. I did go to a place where being a Jew was not as common as it is now, a place like Vassar. There were many Jewish students, but in general, it was a pretty Anglo-Saxon, Protestant conforming institution, and it's gotten a lot better over the years. I think the most important probable barrier sometimes has been that I've been out and gay most of my professional career. And occasionally I felt that circumscribed some of my opportunities. On the other hand, it certainly did not circumscribe my opportunities either at Princeton when I went to be a dean there, or when I returned to Ford as a vice president, or when I came to Rutgers. I think in general, I've been very lucky. I had the privilege of having parents who were both college educated, so they understood the value of going for a university or college degree. I also had the opportunity, I guess, to go to college and not incur incredible debt. I have two daughters who have been lucky enough to do the same thing. One went to Oberlin, one went to Bates. They both sought small liberal arts colleges. Having grown up in New York, they wanted to get out of New York. And they're lucky too, because they were able to go without incurring too much debt. But I do think when I look across the changes over higher education over the last 3 or so decades, the most telling one is the amount of debt that students are incurring by going to college and university. And I'm very much in favor of the politicians who want to do something about that, whether it's to make community college education free, or whether or not to create, as Bernie Sanders and maybe Hillary Clinton, and I'm waiting to see which Republican says this, to make it much easier and more accessible for students to go to college or university. I've had the good fortune of educating or helping to educate, hundreds of students over the course of my career, and I think that matters. Several students I had in community college went on to really interesting careers. I've been in touch with a few, not as many as I would hope. So students, certainly, when you're a faculty member or a teacher, you want to make sure that you've had some impact in a good way. I teach the history of Native Americans here, and I did at Spelman. And I think that's very important, because people generally don't see American Indians as part of the fabric of American life. Granted, very small minority, but they weren't a small minority when Columbus came along. So I have to say, I believe in teaching a more inclusive history of the United States. And it is true that this is a nation of immigrants, but it's also a nation that had original inhabitants. And I got interested in American Indian history when I was an undergraduate. So I hope I have an influence on students about their view of Native Americans and their contributions to American life and their struggles, which continue to this day. Secondly, in terms of impact, having spent so many years as a philanthropist recommending grants at the Ford Foundation, I know that there have been really important opportunities that were provided because of Ford's work, or research and scholarship that happened. One of my favorite examples is that I was there when Ford decided to fund a major project on women writers in Africa, both historically and in terms of present day. This series called Women Writing Africa was published over a probably 10-year period, and the materials are now being used all over the place, not just in the US, but in Africa and other parts of the world. And Ford was very crucial to making that happen. And how do you measure that impact? You know, it's not direct student to faculty, but that was an important one. I also did a lot of work on media and making sure that documentary films that traced the history of the US in a more inclusive and sometimes challenging and controversial way were done. I feel like every career move I had, and I had several, made me a more interesting and open person, including the time I spent in Atlanta. I lived on campus, and there I was, sort of this middle-aged white woman living on a black women's campus. I lived in a dorm that had honor students, and it was a living learning center. I had never spent that much time in the South, and I have to say Atlanta is a very cosmopolitan city, and a city that I came to love. I'm a native New Yorker, but feel very comfortable whenever I return to Atlanta. And Spelman as an institution is a remarkable place. It educates the top leadership in the African American women's world, and I was really privileged to have a chance to be there. No, I don't have any regrets. I mean, maybe I should have left Ford a little earlier than I did. I was a VP there 14 years, and that's a long time. On the other hand, I always found the work so interesting that, you know, I stuck around. Other than that, no, I don't regret any of the places I've been, and I've learned from each of them. But I think the whole question of who pays the freight for going to university or going to college has shifted 180 degrees. And I think that is an example of society becoming overly individualized and corporatized. And so the benefit of going to college is only perceived as an individual benefit as opposed to a societal benefit. And I have worried about this phenomenon from earliest days, really from the 80s on. And I think that one is one I do understand, I have written about, and feel very strongly that we need to recalibrate the whole question of who benefits from a better educated workforce. The truth is, the individual does benefit, we know that, but much more significantly, society benefits. The famous example was the University of California and the California State Colleges and the California Community Colleges, a three-tiered system that helped to really catalyze economic development in the state of California in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now, even the California model is under real strain, and I feel strongly that public higher education needs an infusion of support, not just from the states, but from the federal government, and I'm in favor of whatever it will take to make going to college easier for vast numbers of American high school graduates. And they don't have to go to college immediately, but certainly the opportunity to have, if you will, a passport to higher education for everyone who has the inclination and the stick-to-itiveness and the brains to get something important out of college or university life needs to be revisited and valued. So that's one. A second one, and I've also written on the subject of corporatization of higher education, how higher education, which used to be seen as a societal good, is now seen as an individual good, and colleges and universities are being run much more in a business model than when I was in school and getting my doctorate. So I'm worried about that. I wrote a lot about that in the book I published just a year and a half ago. With regard to international issues, I think the United States in general is coming to grips with the fact that we can't solve all problems internationally by using the military. And I think the lessons of Vietnam need to be relearned, whether it's Iran or Iraq or Libya. I think there are threats to our freedoms and security, but I tend to see diplomacy as much more appropriate and necessary, and not necessarily being the world's policeman. So I'm worried about that, and how we haven't really learned the lessons of Vietnam enough. And back in the United States, the last thing I would say is that I'm very well aware that we incarcerate more people than any other country on earth as a percentage. And I'm concerned that the gap between haves and have-nots has grown in my career life. And I think, again, we have to look to the common good and not just to individual advancement. So when I came to IWL, we had a tagline and it was called Advancing Women's Leadership. And I liked it, but I decided we needed to add 4 words: for a just world. So now it's Advancing Women's Leadership for a Just World, and everybody agreed that was a good thing to do. I wouldn't be here if I felt that all we were doing was just helping individuals to advance. Among other things, we're trying to raise funds to enable more students to participate in the programs of the IWL, and a broader range of students. I talked about, for example, community college students participating, or transfers. Setting up this Gloria Steinem initiative so that more women assume leadership positions in media is very important to this, because the media does not cover, in my judgment, sufficiently these important economic gaps between those at the top 1% and the rest of us. And I think that the media are really ubiquitous, and they basically control the narrative. And unless women who are interested in a fairer and just world are part of that leadership class, it's not going to happen. I also have to say I don't believe in women's leadership simply because women have biological differences from men. I don't believe in women's leadership per se. It's leadership towards what end? And the series that we're developing, which will have its first volumes out in 2016, is about case studies of women's leadership that look to do something that would improve the lot of people. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But what we're trying to understand is what went into their decision making. So yeah, I think, I'm in education because I have seen education transform lives. But I'm not interested in just transforming one life at a time. I'm interested also in making sure that education is accessible to collectivities of people. And I'm a bit concerned, no, more than a bit concerned, that over the last 30 years, really since the Reagan Revolution, that hasn't happened. I've done some workshops for history majors here at Rutgers especially about how they can translate their love of history into other careers besides academic careers. So let me say a few words about that. First of all, it's not sufficient just to have a PhD. Remember I said that I was working on my PhD and I was teaching in a community college, and I worked on setting up the first program on women and gender studies there. And I think it's fair to say that alongside one's academic work, a student really ought to say to herself or himself, what do I have a passion for? If I have a passion strictly to be an academic or be a scholar or be a researcher, fine. There are lots of ways to be scholars and researchers. I mean, you just don't have to have a tenured position at a place like Rutgers. You can work in archives, you can work in museums, you can work actually in public history, doing histories of organizations that need to reflect back on where they've been. There should be a really better history, for example, of the Ford Foundation. And maybe in my next career move, I'll try to do that. But right now, what I would advise students is to make sure that they become involved in whatever passion they have for changing the world and making a difference. So, for example, if you want a job in philanthropy, one way to get a job in philanthropy is to work in an organization that has, in fact, a relationship to philanthropy, whether it's a battered women's shelter, whether it's a program like, think it's called Mountain View here, which works with formerly incarcerated prisoners and helps them to finish their degrees here. I mean, I think there are many ways to demonstrate a commitment besides just doing academic study. And I would urge anyone who wants another kind of career, either alongside of or sequentially from their academic career, to volunteer and become deeply invested in some nonprofit. I've only operated in the nonprofit world, so I'm not the best person to talk about working towards a career in the profit-making world. But if you're interested in nonprofits, you have to vote with your feet. You need to be out there. You need to be working there. So for me, I think the turning point was working in a community college and realizing all of the struggles and barriers that students overcame to come to that place. I remember it was in the 1970s, one of the programs we had was for returning Vietnam vets. We were one of the first places in the country to have a program like that. I know that Rutgers actually does very well with returning vets, or at least I've read studies and reports that suggest that. Well, I think these are very important opportunities, and if you work on issues of returning vets or formerly incarcerated students, you begin to see what is the connection between your education and your privileges and opportunities and those who haven't had them. Ford never hired anyone to give away money. I'm not talking about administrative work at Ford, like being a grant administrator where you keep track of the grants once they're made. But someone who's typically called a program officer doesn't tend to go from graduate school to the Ford Foundation or to the Rockefeller Foundation. They need to have some on-the-ground, first-hand experience in an organization that does the work that philanthropy funds. So, I actually, this is a good story. When I left the Ford Foundation in 1990 to go to work at Princeton, I took a salary cut of $30,000. I was making $30,000 more at Ford than I was making at Princeton. And it was costing me more to get to Princeton than it cost me to go to Ford on the subway. My daughters, I have two daughters, they're twins, and they're 28, and both of them have advanced degrees. They have undergraduate degrees, and one is a teacher of 8th grade students, U.S. history, and one is a public defender. She's a lawyer representing women who are in danger of losing their kids to the foster care system, etc. And both of them are making, one with a master's and one with a law degree, in the high 50s. So I guess I would say somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 is probably the right amount of money to work in the nonprofit sector, or to have a master's degree. If you have a PhD and you're looking for a teaching job, you might be able to bump your salary up a little bit more. But I would say be prepared to start at a lower rank at the $40,000 to $60,000 a year level. And that is tough, because if you live in the New York metropolitan area, which I consider New Brunswick to be part of, it's very hard to live in Manhattan or now even Brooklyn. But finding positions in Staten Island or in New Jersey, in parts of New Jersey, and making that salary does seem to work. I would say that the talent pool of international students is far greater now than when I was in graduate school in the 70s, 80s, and I finished up in the mid-80s. And I think nonprofits are looking for talent wherever they can find it. What they can't do, and what's hard for them, I think, or not can't do, but find it hard to do, is sponsor students, or sponsor non-U.S. citizens, because that's a financial burden that many nonprofits can't take on. On the other hand, I would not want to deter any student who wants to work in the nonprofit sector and who doesn't carry a green card or a U.S. citizenship from trying. But I think it is harder, let's put it that way, but worth the effort. Especially in certain fields that are seen as non-applied. like history, philosophy, English, the quote humanities, and several of the social sciences, not the business school, not social work. Those departments need to value their students who are not going into academic jobs every bit as much as they value students who, in a sense, become their clones and the next generation of academics. So yeah, the history department has asked me to talk about this several times. I think there could be a much more systemic opportunity for graduate students to meet up with and be mentored by people who have been in the nonprofit sector with doctorates. I'm sure that Rutgers PhDs are not all working in academia, and there ought to be a kind of clearinghouse where Rutgers PhDs make themselves available to mentor students in their own fields. So yes, I think there could be a much more intensive outreach to people who went into fields that are adjacent to academia but not necessarily tenure track positions. Philanthropy is adjacent to academia, museums are adjacent to academia, archives, documentary filmmaking, all of that. And here at IWL, we've done a lot to try to broaden students' engagement with those nonprofit as well as profit fields. Well, first they have to demonstrate a passion for that organization, understand what it does, and volunteer. And not just volunteer for a semester, but actually say, this is the place I'm going to invest time and my skill set for. And I think that doesn't happen after you finish your PhD. It has to happen while you're working on it. And granted, PhDs are tough and require a lot of effort. In my case, it was teaching, and teaching in a community college. But I also got very much involved in the women's movement and in consciousness raising groups in the 70s when that was very big, what we call them CR groups, and the women's movement in general. So I became involved in efforts to pass the ERA and groups that were interested in that, the Equal Rights Amendment, which we still haven't passed in this country, shockingly. Yeah, I became more of an activist academic, not just an academic. And that probably contributed to my openness to working at FIPSE, the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. So I worked for the government, and then eventually to the Ford Foundation, because they not only looked at my academic credentials, they also looked at what I did with my life. And I think graduate students need to be a bit more well-rounded. The academic marketplace right now is as tough as it's ever been, probably tougher. And you know, in my day, people wanted careers in Ivy League and research universities, and they felt that they had failed if they had gotten a job in a community college. Nowadays, I think most graduate students feel very grateful if they can get a full-time tenure-track position anywhere. In my judgment, that's still important, and people should go for that. But they should also have what I call, Plan B. And Plan B is working in a place that you believe in and think that that place is doing important work, and using whatever skills you've acquired as a graduate student to help move that place's agenda along. When I was working at Ford, we funded something called Public Allies, which is a nonprofit that matches students with jobs in the public sector. And by public sector, I don't mean just government. I mean, or federal government, municipal government, nonprofits, etc. And I believe, there are, if you start looking for volunteer service of some kind or another, that's a good place to start. I also think AmeriCorps is a really important organization. And when I was at Ford, we helped sow the seeds for the passage of AmeriCorps as a program. Points of Light was another one that Ford funded. Points of Light was an organization that the former President Bush 41, not 43, really became involved with. George H.W. Bush, not George W. Bush. So on both sides of the political aisle, there are nonprofits that you can get involved with. And I think career services here at Rutgers, which I've had very little to do with, should be sort of as interested in helping to place students in the nonprofit sector as it is in helping to place students in the profit sector. That said, I will give a caveat. If I were a student now with a lot of debt, it would be much harder for me to work in the nonprofit sector because I wouldn't be necessarily able to repay some of this debt. On the other hand, there are programs which, for instance, I think AmeriCorps may be one, where while you're working there, you can pay down your debt, or you can figure out a way to have some organization cover some of that. At least it's worth looking at, but I recognize you have to be both an idealist and a pragmatist, and you need to be able to find work that helps you overcome debt. And in my day, that wasn't as pronounced as it is today, and I regret that. And I should have done more as a higher education person to deal with that problem. My strongest piece of advice is that careers are not linear. You don't go from this job to the next job to the next job in any kind of linear progression. You may well need to, and I'll use a sailing term, although I'm not a sailor, you may need to tack. You may need to go where the winds blow and where your passion is or enthusiasm. And that's okay too. For me, I mean, some people, and they're lucky, know what they want to do from high school on. They know that, in fact, there are opportunities for them in that part of the workplace, and they get there, and then they work their way up. I was not one of those people. I thought I was, but I wasn't. And so, you know, I think the figure is that people will have 6 or 7 different jobs during their career. In the old days, you probably went to work for IBM and you stayed there for 30, 40 years. I stayed at Ford 14 years, which is the longest I ever stayed at a job. And I've had many different jobs, and not all of them did I imagine existed or where I could make a contribution, but no regrets. I've really benefited from every place I've been.